Well, good day, my friends. It's your old pal, Jordan the Lion. How are you all doing today? I hope you said great. Today we're going to be coming to you from the Bronx, New York. We are going to go to Woodlawn Cemetery. There are a lot of famous, well-known people buried there. I mean, so many we'll never be able to see them all. Everything from Grandfather Westinghouse to Miles Davis, Herman Melville, Irving Berlin. The list goes on and on. So let's go. Daze with Jordan the Lion, you all, and Woodlawn Cemetery begins now. We've made it to Woodlawn. This place is massive. This is so big. It's one of the biggest cemeteries I think I've ever been to. So that's why I say we're not going to be able to find everybody. This big, massive mausoleum belongs to Anna Hyatt. Well, Anna von Hyatt Huntington, who was a famous sculptor. She was known for doing a lot of animal sculptures in New York City, but she is probably most known for, she did the big Joan of Arc statue in New York on 93rd Street. And she was pretty remarkable because it was she was a big name, very prominent in a time where women in that field were not really that successful. They weren't taken seriously as artists. She traveled the world exhibiting her work and won multiple awards. Let's go up here and see her tomb. This is something. Look at that, wow. She ended up contracting tuberculosis, and even though she battled it for a very long time, she ended up beating it. She ended up surviving it. It's pretty amazing. She also had her art exhibited at the 1928 Summer Olympics. She ended up marrying a very, very wealthy man, and together they became big philanthropists. They ended up donating to or opening 14 museums and 4 wildlife preserves. Every time I'm in a cemetery, I always want to just hum the Beetlejuice theme or whistle it. So the next grave we're looking for is right over here. It's actually satirist, humorist, critic, poet, Dorothy Parker. Also playwright, screenwriter, all that stuff. She had a great career. Leave for her a red young rose, go your way and save your pity. She is happy for she knows that her dust is very pretty. Yeah, she was an interesting lady, to be sure. She was, I mean, I think what I knew her from was that I had seen that she had written A Star is Born, the original Jeanette Gaynor one. But yeah, what a funny lady. She was, apparently she early on met a man that it was another actor. She was trying to be an actor and he was trying to be an actor as well. His name is Alan Campbell, and he actually mainly wanted to become a screenwriter. She wanted to be an actress, but they ended up together getting contracts to go out to Hollywood. They were married for years and they got contracts to go out to Hollywood as actors, but he really wanted to be a screenwriter, and then they both basically fell into screenwriting. But she eventually found out during their marriage that he was bisexual, and said that when she found out, she said that he was queer as a billy goat, but they stayed together. And I mean, she was known for making like these really funny comments. Like I said, she would always, she eventually would end up writing criticism articles in the papers. Remember, one of the things she said was that when Calvin Coolidge died, she said, "How could they tell?" But they ended up, her and her husband ended up getting contracts to go out to Hollywood as actors. I think his contract was $250 a week, hers was $1,000, but they eventually were making a couple of $1,000s a week. And with her husband, Alan Campbell, and Robert Carson, she wrote the 1937 script for A Star is Born. It was nominated for an Academy Award. Then she wrote some of the dialogue for The Little Foxes. She wrote tons of stuff over the years. I mean, she ended up, sadly though, got accused of being a sympathizer and got blacklisted in Hollywood, which, you know, of course, anytime you, in that time, anytime you said anything disparaging about the wrong person, they could accuse you and pretty much kill your career. But she was very left-wing, and so because of her politics, she ended up being blacklisted. But she had 2 Academy Award nominations and wrote, I believe, 14 screenplays. And apparently gets a lot of visitors. Look at all those red roses. Horrible. A lot of careers were ruined. A lot of people had to risk their own neck to hire people like Dorothy Parker so they could make a living because they felt bad for them. But those same people that would hire them were risking being blacklisted themselves. Pretty easy to find because he's had a lot of visitors. You can see on top there's even a couple of whales. Some writing devices, because we are at the grave of the great author, poet Herman Melville. Herman Melville wrote and was probably most known for Moby Dick. Here's his wife Elizabeth right next to him. Yeah, Herman Melville is an interesting story. His family, when his father died, the family was just basically in complete financial ruins. So Herman ended up going to sea, hopping on a boat in 1839, becoming a sailor on a merchant ship. And when it hit the Marquise Islands, he decided just to hop off and not return, and ended up meeting the people on the island, living with the people on the island, and then wrote 2 books about his experiences. Wrote these like romantic adventures about his experiences, and they were actually pretty popular. One was called Typee and the other was Omu, and they were based off of his experiences, and he ended up making a lot of money. So he became financially stable from all of this and was able to marry his sweetheart, Elizabeth. Now, he also wrote, of course, Moby Dick, but when Moby Dick came out, it was not a success. People really didn't seem to like it. Took him a year and a half to write it, but when it came out, the audience just didn't seem to care. And he eventually ended up writing other books and became a customs inspector and everything. But at the end of his life, nobody cared about Moby Dick. It wasn't until the 20th century that people brought it back, started talking about this romantic tale of a man at sea battling this whale, and it became a big-time classic. I think it's one of those heroic stories that they always teach in schools now. Born August 1st, 1819, died September 28th, 1891. Lived a good long life though. Thank you for your work, Mr. Melville. He did live that long life. He ended up passing away of cardiovascular disease and was actually working on a novella at the time called Billy Budd. It was not finished at the time of his death, but they did eventually release it in 1924, shortly after Moby Dick had become a classic. Right off here, off to the side of the road, you're thinking, or at least I was thinking when I saw it on the map, like, oh, it's got to be one of these big giant ones. No, right here, very humble, this Russian immigrant, the great Irving Berlin, maybe one of the greatest songwriters of all time. When I was learning how to play music, they were telling us about the Great American Songbook. There are like certain songs that are just known as American classics, and he was the author of many of those. So Down here we have his son, Irving Jr. Over here his wife. And him. Now, he was pretty amazing because, you know, he wrote like 1,500 songs. And a lot of them were like classics, instant classics. In fact, Irving Berlin was said by Walter Cronkite to have helped write the story of the country, capturing the best of who we are and the dreams that shape our lives. He had a 60-year career, wrote for 20 original Broadway shows and 15 original Hollywood movies, including White Christmas, Anything You Can Do, I Can Do Better, There's No Business Like Show Business, Kate Smith doing God Bless America was with Irving Berlin. It's amazing. He also was responsible for Ronald Reagan doing This Is the Army. He's had tons and tons of celebrities, famous singers, everyone from Perry Como to Al Jolson to Sammy Davis Jr., Elvis, Rosemary Clooney, Cher, Nat King Cole, all do his songs. He actually lived to be 101. Growing up, I would hear the name Gershwin Berlin, and even George Gershwin called Irving Berlin the greatest songwriter that's ever lived. It's quite a compliment. Irving Berlin could not read sheet music. He could play a little bit of piano, but only in F sharp, and he was able to do all of that. A 60-year career of classics with that limited ability. It's amazing. There's a very famous one right here in front of us. Very, very famous. All kinds of stories about this guy. Just like the centerpiece he was in life, always in the limelight, we have maybe the most famous trumpet player I've ever heard of or known of. Every record store I ever worked in, I had people in there telling me how brilliant Miles Davis was. Here's his grave. Kinda Blue is considered maybe the most classic jazz album. Or, you know, the weird thing is he's jazz, but he went so much further. That's what people loved about him. He wasn't just a jazz musician, a trumpeter, a band leader, all that stuff. He was an inventor. He took playing trumpet into a different level. When I went to Musicians Institute, I had guitar player teachers that told me they had little brief bouts with him where they were either going to work for him or did work for him for a while, and they would tell me he was very tough. He said, one guy said, yeah, he said, Miles liked to do a lot of blow, and he said, I remember one night he called me to his room, and I walk in there and he's sitting there doing that, eating a bucket of fried chicken, and I stood there for an hour and he never said a word to me. We never talked. He said it was just, he said you just never knew what you were going to get with this guy. But like I said, the name is synonymous with jazz music and just pushing the boundaries of jazz music. He was born in Alton, Illinois, and was raised in East St. Louis and went to study at Juilliard. But he ended up dropping out and became a saxophonist for Charlie Parker. And then he recorded the Birth of the Cool sessions, which is also one of those real classic recordings, Birth of the Cool for Capitol. And then, of course, he was known to have problems with drugs, and one of those was recorded an entire album while he was on heroin. And then he tried to do a comeback with Columbia at the Newport Jazz Festival, and he was just always changing band members. Like I said, it was, from everything I had heard, it was just his behavior was very erratic. And he was actually married to Cicely Tyson, who is also buried in this cemetery. I was surprised when I was reading up on all the people that were here. I did not realize that they were married. But there lies the great Miles Davis. And then I noticed, and I was kind of wondering about this, I was like, you know, somebody that influential, I wonder if other musicians end up want to be buried near him or around him. And when I pulled up, I immediately looked over and saw here Jean-Baptiste Illinois Jacquet, famed saxophone player. There's even an image of him playing his saxophone on there. And then right up this hill, I see another man. You see actually a lot of them that have music, like staffs and stuff on there, so they all were musicians. I don't know this one, but Weston Hill. Miles was also a painter, and sadly was painting, or had painted his last work right at the end of his life. In September of 1991, he went into his doctor appointment and they suggested that they put in a tracheal tube for him. And he threw a fit, which led to a hemorrhage inside his body, and he went into a coma. And sadly, he had, on September 26th, he had painted his final painting, and it was like this dark, ghostly figure dripping blood, and it said imminent demise. After several days being on life support, they ended up turning off the machines, and he passed away on September 28th. So painted that almost like he could foresee his death in the painting that he did 2 days before. So now if we leave Miles, I showed you to the right, but to the left, right over here, is also jazz legend Duke Ellington. You can see there's a cross here. It says, "The Lord is my shepherd." And down at the bottom it says Ellington. And then if you walk out here, you have McHenry Boatwright, Ruth Ellington, his parents, and then Duke, the great Duke Ellington, and his wife Eve. So Duke was a jazz pianist. He fell in love with jazz when he was a young man and got to eventually start his own band in 1923 and led that band, his jazz orchestra, the Ellington Orchestra, until his death, 1974. What's interesting is that, you know, he was from DC, but he based his whole career out of New York City and got his start at the Cotton Club, the world famous Cotton Club. But he eventually made a friend named Billy Strayhorn, and they became songwriting partners, and they were actually 30-year partners. You never hear that. He was also a pianist, and they would write some of the songs that Duke would end up performing throughout his career, and many of Duke's songs would also become American standards. Now Evie, right next to him, he had actually originally married his high school sweetheart, but while he was performing at the Cotton Club, he met Evie, who was working there, and he fell in love with her. And sadly, you know, unfortunately had to break up his marriage, but he ended up supporting both women his entire life. Kind of an upstanding thing to do. Duke Ellington unfortunately passed away of lung cancer and pneumonia just a few weeks after his 75th birthday. Ella Fitzgerald was at his funeral and said, "It's a very sad day. A genius has passed." So I was wondering why I couldn't find a listing for where Cicely Tyson was buried. She's buried with Miles Davis. Apparently they had an affair through the 60s, and she's on the cover of his Sorcerer album. But he was married then, and then when he got a divorce, they got married, and they were married until 2 years before his death when she asked for a divorce. But she wanted to be buried there with him anyway. At her funeral was Bill and Hillary Clinton, Lenny Kravitz, Tyler Perry. Pretty star-studded event. Right over here This one is called The Memorial to Marriage. I thought that was really nice. So Miles Davis was right down here, and we've come up the road a little bit, and we have famous drummer Max Roach. Maybe one of the greatest drummers in the history of drumming. He was a pioneer of bebop, was a famous jazz drummer and composer, worked with Coleman Hawkins, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Sonny Rollins, Dinah Washington, Thelonious Monk, Miles Davis, Duke Ellington. Pretty amazing. He's in the Downbeat Hall of Fame for drumming in 1980 and is in the Modern Drummer Hall of Fame as of 1992. What an amazing career. And then if we walk a little further up, you see a headstone right here, and it tells us exactly who she is. We have Norma Miller, the Queen of Swing. Swing, baby, swing. Lived almost 100 years. It says, much loved Lindy Hopper, comedian, jazz dancer, choreographer, actress, singer, author, and composer. That's great. Norma ended up passing away of congestive heart failure and actually was working on a new album at the time. Then just to the right of Norma is famed saxophonist and composer Jackie McLean. That's a pretty cool grave. Very artistic. I love the drawing on there. That's awesome. He was a band leader, composer, educator. Is in the Downbeat Hall of Fame. You can see they have a headstone right here. Says Jackie McLean, alto saxophonist, educator, composer, activist, founder of the Artist Collective, the Jackie McLean Institute of Jazz at Hart School, University of Hartford, loving husband and father, my sweetheart, my love, doll. He was loved, that's for sure. So right over here, next person that we were looking for, also a musician, right here, Felix Pappalardi. He formed the band Mountain. That's probably what most people are know him from. Mountain played at Woodstock. They were known for the Great Train Robbery song, Mississippi Queen. But he got his start, he was from the Bronx. He was from here. Moved to Michigan, went to the University of Michigan to study music and couldn't really find work, so he went to where the work was. Heard about Greenwich Village, went to Greenwich Village and found all these folk musicians like Joan Baez and the Youngbloods, Tim Hardin, and ended up producing them, produced some of their records. And then he went on to meet and manage the group Cream, also co-wrote the song Strange Brew with Eric Clapton, and then eventually got out of managing Cream so that he could start Mountain. Pretty amazing story. Sadly, at the end of his life, he was shot and killed by his wife. She was convicted of being criminally negligent for homicide. Only served 4 years. Pretty sad ending. grave of journalist Nellie Bly. Elizabeth Cochran Seaman was her name. And the New York Press Club, her print name was Nellie Bly. Now she had an interesting story because she actually went and lived out Jules Verne's story of going around the world in 80 days. She actually did it in 72 days. She was famous for that, but then she was also famous for, she was looking for a journalism job, couldn't find anything, and then went to Joseph Pulitzer at his paper and pitched herself as wanting to do an expose on an insane asylum. And so she got herself committed at a woman's lunatic asylum, that's what it was called in those days, on Roosevelt Island. She said it wasn't easy to be admitted. First she had to check herself into a temporary home for females, stayed up all night to give herself a wide-eyed look of a disturbed woman, and began making accusations that the other boarders were insane. There's so many crazy people about, and one can never tell what they will do. She refused to go to bed and eventually scared so many of the boarders, the police were called to take her to the nearby courthouse. Once they examined her, the judge and police officer and doctor and everyone, she was taken to Blackwell's Island and pretended to be insane, and later wrote in book form something called 10 Days in a Madhouse, and it was a sensation. She became like an overnight celebrity. Now we have an international superstar coming up next. So this beautiful mausoleum here is that of Queen of the Salsa, Celia Cruz. Sold more than 10 million records, entertained people for years. She was officially known as Queen of the Salsa. She was Cuban born and made a name for herself in Cuba, and then was able to come to America and perform. Look how beautiful the stained glass is in here. So you can see she's right over here to the left. And then across from her, Pedro Knight. She has a bit of a sad story for part of her life. She was off touring in Mexico when Fidel Castro took over Cuba, and when she went back to Cuba, she saw that everything was pretty much shut down, and so she went out publicly criticizing Castro, and she knew that that would probably like get her, at least it would probably hurt her career. But that's exactly what it did, because when she took a job to go perform in Mexico City, when she tried to return home, she was denied. She found out while she was in Mexico that her father had died, and she tried to come back, and the Cuban government refused to let her in. So she ended up having to buy a house in Fort Lee, New Jersey. And even though she tried to get back to visit her mother because her mother was sick with bladder cancer, the Cuban government again refused to let her. So about a year later, she ended up marrying Pedro. They had been romancing each other for several years and decided to get married. How sad is that? Be a performer, go off performing, and then come back to see that power has completely changed politically in your country. Everything is terrible, and that you feel like the only thing you can do is to make people aware of it, and by doing that you end up getting exiled. Celia ended up dying at that home in Fort Lee, New Jersey, but she had stipulated in her will that she wanted to first be taken to Miami her remains be taken to Miami so that the fans of hers of Cuban descent could come and visit her, and then she wanted to be brought back up here and buried. But she also wanted soil from Guantanamo Bay here at her resting place used in her final burial. So from over here you can see a mausoleum back there called, this says Pickford. That's where we're gonna head to next. So even though it says Pickford, it's actually the grave of actress Olive Thomas. She made movies for Triangle Pictures, which I believe was the that was that group that Tom Ince formed. But she was a model, she was an actress. She originally got her start by meeting Florence Ziegfeld of the Ziegfeld Follies. He saw her perform and made her a dancer, put her on Broadway, and then eventually she ended up getting married, changing her name to Olive Thomas, and then she got divorced, went off to find work, and ended up marrying Jack Pickford. She met Jack Pickford at a dance on the Santa Monica Pier, and they fell in love. So they ended up getting married. Actually, that's why it says Pickford, but Jack's not actually even buried here. He's buried in Los Angeles. But, which is kind of sad when you hear how Olive Thomas, who's buried here, how she passed away. It's really sad. You know, she was making movies for Triangle Pictures, and then basically what happened was they had been apart for quite a while, making movies separately, and when they got back together she found out that he had contracted a venereal disease, and so he had syphilis medication. And one night they when they were back together, they were planning a second honeymoon, as a matter of fact, and they went out for a night on the town, coming back to their room after the bars closed and everything around 3 a.m. and because it was dark, she accidentally took mercury bichloride, which had been prescribed to her husband to treat his syphilis. She accidentally took a really large quantity of that, thinking that they were sleeping pills, and it turned out that it was poisonous, and she was rushed to the American hospital in Paris, but she ended up passing away. And she was interred here. Sad story, huh? Jeez. Poor Olive Thomas. Now we're going to visit the grave of an acting legend, part of the Mercury Theater with Orson Welles. I knew her. Some of my favorite stuff is when she was in Easy Money with Rodney Dangerfield and playing Martha in the Arthur movies with Dudley Moore. So over here where it says Sheftel, we are looking for, and here she is, right here in front, Geraldine Fitzgerald Sheftel, beloved wife and mother. You could also put legendary theatrical actress, I would say. She is considered in the top 20 of all-time greatest Irish actresses. She is in the American Theater Hall of Fame. She was nominated for an Academy Award and Tony and Emmy Awards. She made a name for herself in, one of the things was Wuthering Heights, but also with Bette Davis in Dark Victory. Now she was actually up for the villain part in The Maltese Falcon, but she ended up getting into a fight with Jack Warner. But where I know her from, and where a lot of you and people from my generation probably recognize her, is, like I said, if you ever watched Easy Money, she was the old battle axe mother of Rose. It's Monty who plays Rodney Dangerfield. It's his mother-in-law. And she hates him. She hates him, but when she dies in the movie, or we think she dies, she puts a stipulation that if he can clean up his ways, lose weight, quit drinking, quit philandering, all the things that he does, smoking, all that stuff, within a year, that basically his family will get the fortune. If not, another member of the family gets it, played by Jeffrey Jones. And a year later comes and goes, and he cleans himself up, and then we find out that she's actually still alive and just wanted to help him clean up his life. So at the very end, you see him like basically like sitting at a big stretched fancy dinner table with her. Oh, I shouldn't have that, right, Mom? Just, you know, her best friend and everything. And then you see him walk downstairs, start eating pizza with his gambling buddies. And he's like, for years, I wouldn't kiss my mother-in-law's face. I end up kissing her ass. Then she's also, I knew her from being Martha in the Arthur movies with Dudley Moore. She was the rich aunt when, especially in Arthur 2, when he goes, because he's married to Linda and Susan wants him, he's telling Martha, I don't love her. And she's sitting there, quote unquote, working out, which is she hires this buff, studly looking, like TV looking aerobics guy to come to her house and work out while she sits on the couch and watches. That's when she's telling him, who cares about love? Just marry the hag. Take the money and be happy. You can have all the Lindas you want. Well, my friends, I hope you enjoyed all the graves that we visited today. We could easily come back here and make 2 or 3 videos. This is just a massive place and it's very hard to find people. So I hope you enjoyed all the people we visited today. Thank you all for watching from the Bronx, New York, Woodlawn Cemetery. Have a great night and goodbye.